What would you do if the person you trusted most betrayed you in the worst possible way? Imagine coming back stronger from a life-threatening crisis, only to walk in on your wife and best friend in your own bed. How does a man survive when everything he's fought for is shattered in an instant? Stick around, this story will take you places you never expected. The truth is darker than you think. Before we jump into this shocking story, comment below where you're tuning in from today. And make sure to like and subscribe for more intense, unforgettable stories that will stay with you long after the screen fades. David sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the small bottle of pills in his hand. He wasn't quite sure how he felt about the heart attack that had nearly taken his life, but he was sure about one thing. It had changed everything. The doctors said he was recovering well. His numbers were improving, his strength was coming back slowly. But they didn't tell him about the other effects. The ones no one talks about, the loss of confidence, the sense of his own mortality that clung to him like a heavy coat, and the hardest part, intimacy. It had been months since the heart attack, but David still felt a shadow hanging over him. The physical strain it put on him was visible, even in small moments, like when he tried to reach for his wife Rebecca late at night. She would hold him, but there was something different in her touch. The warmth, the tenderness, all seemed to be slipping away. He hadn't wanted to admit it at first, but now it was clear. Intimacy, in every form, was a struggle. His physical recovery was his top priority, but it seemed like no matter how hard he worked to get back to normal, something had shifted between him and Rebecca. It wasn't just the lack of sex, it was the quiet withdrawal on her end. It was the distance that grew between them, like a slow-moving tide that he couldn't stop. He tried to be patient with himself, reminding himself that healing takes time. But every time she avoided his touch, every time she pulled away, he felt like a piece of himself was being chipped away. Rebecca had always been the one who took care of David, who made sure he took his medicine, kept up with his doctor's appointments, and pushed him to keep going when he wanted to give up. She had been there for him through the darkest days after his heart attack. But as the weeks went by, she began to change too. The exhaustion of caring for him, of trying to hold everything together, started to show in small ways. Her smile, once bright and full of warmth, had become forced. She spent more time away from home, saying she needed to clear her head or catch up with friends. David noticed, but he told himself it was just the stress of the situation. It had to be. She couldn't possibly be drifting away from him, could she? He knew her frustrations had built up, especially when it came to their lack of intimacy. He saw it in the way she would sigh after one of his failed attempts to get close. He saw it in the way she looked at him, almost as if she was looking past him rather than at him. One evening, after a particularly awkward dinner, David found himself sitting in the living room with Jason, his best friend of many years. They had shared a lifetime of stories, laughs, confessions, and life-changing moments. Jason had always been the kind of friend who offered a shoulder to lean on, who listened when no one else did. And tonight, David needed that. "Man, something's off with Rebecca," David confessed, his voice low as if he were sharing a secret he wasn't sure he should. I don't know, she's just not herself lately." Jason, who had been sitting across from him with a beer in hand, leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing. "You mean you think she's pulling away?" David nodded, looking at the ground. "Yeah, I mean, it's like she's avoiding me, and when we're together it just feels distant. I don't know if it's just me, but I feel like she's not even looking at me the same way anymore." Jason took a slow sip of his beer, his expression thoughtful. "That's tough, man, but you're getting better, right? I'm sure she's just stressed or maybe worried about your health. You've been through a lot." David sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Yeah, I know, but it feels like more than that. I can't put my finger on it, but something's wrong." Jason nodded slowly. "Maybe you just need to talk to her about it, man. Sometimes we just assume things instead of asking. Maybe she's feeling some kind of way that she hasn't been able to express. You've been through a lot together." David nodded, but the doubt in his mind was still there. Jason's words comforted him, but they didn't erase the gnawing feeling in his gut. Something wasn't right. He wasn't sure if it was his own insecurities or something deeper, but it was becoming harder to ignore. As David sat there talking with Jason, he couldn't help but notice how Jason kept glancing at his phone. It was subtle, just a flicker of movement in his eyes, but David caught it. Something about it felt odd. He pushed it out of his mind, trying to stay focused on the conversation, but he couldn't shake the thought. Why was Jason acting so differently around Rebecca lately? Had he noticed it too? The day David was set to leave for his business trip had arrived. His bags were packed, his flight was confirmed, and as he stood by the door he turned to Rebecca, who was quietly standing near the kitchen counter. Her eyes met his, but there was something in her gaze, something distant. It was the kind of look she had been giving him for weeks now, the kind that made David feel like he was standing next to a stranger, not the woman he had spent nearly a decade with. "Hey, I'll be back before you know it," David said, trying to sound upbeat even though a part of him felt like the distance between them was growing by the second. Rebecca gave him a small, forced smile. "Yeah, just take care of yourself, don't overdo it, all right?" Her voice was calm, but there was an underlying coldness in it, something that made David pause for a moment. The kiss she placed on his cheek lingered a little too long, and as she pulled away, David couldn't help but feel an odd emptiness. He shook off the feeling, assuming it was just his mind playing tricks on him. After all, he had been through so much, physically. His recovery was still ongoing, and maybe it was simply the stress getting to both of them. He gave her a final nod, grabbed his suitcase and walked out the door. On the way to the airport, his phone buzzed with a message from Rebecca. It was brief, just a simple, "Have a good trip. I'll be fine here. See you soon." David stared at the text as he sat in the back of the taxi, a wave of unease washing over him. Something about the words didn't sit right. Her usual sweet tone seemed absent. He dismissed it, telling himself it was just paranoia. Maybe he was just imagining things because he was about to leave. Still, the pit in his stomach refused to settle. As David's flight took off, Rebecca settled into the silence of their empty house. The hum of the fridge, the occasional sound of a car passing by, all reminded her that she was alone. But not truly alone. Not anymore. She spent the next few hours sitting on the couch, scrolling through social media, trying to distract herself from the thoughts racing through her mind. The house felt too big, too quiet without David there, and for the first time in a long while, she welcomed the silence. She had been carrying a heavy weight on her shoulders, and it felt like a relief to be able to just breathe without having to hide her frustration. Her fingers moved across the screen of her phone as she flicked through posts, pictures, and messages. It was only a matter of time before she stumbled upon Jason's profile. He had posted a new picture, one of him out with friends at a bar. Rebecca didn't know why, but she clicked on his name and started scrolling through his feed. His posts were lighthearted, filled with jokes and memories from their shared past. And then a message notification popped up. It was from him. "How's everything going with David?" Jason's message read. The question casual but with an undercurrent of concern. Rebecca's heart skipped a beat. She hesitated for a moment before typing back, "Same old, you know how it is. He's getting better physically, but it feels like everything else is slipping." Jason responded almost immediately, "I know, you've been under a lot of stress. How are you holding up?" She could feel the weight of his words. It was exactly what she needed to hear, someone who understood the emotional strain she was going through. David's struggles, her own loneliness, the unspoken distance between them. It was all too much to carry by herself. Their conversation continued for hours, moving from her frustrations with David to more personal topics, even laughing about old memories. She found herself smiling, a real smile for the first time in weeks. Jason's words brought comfort she hadn't realized she'd been craving. He understood her in a way David didn't seem to anymore. As the days went on, Rebecca found herself drawn deeper into these late-night conversations. They started sharing more personal thoughts, her frustrations, his. Soon they were talking about their feelings for each other, a silent bond that had always been there but had never been acted upon. It wasn't long before that bond became something more. Jason started offering her the kind of attention she had been starving for, the kind that made her feel seen, wanted, even desired. And Rebecca, starved for intimacy, starved for attention, didn't pull away. She allowed herself to sink deeper into the comfort he provided, rationalizing that it was just harmless conversation. It was just an outlet, a way to ease the loneliness. But she was lying to herself. One evening, after days of building emotional closeness, Rebecca found herself standing at the kitchen counter, holding her phone, staring at a new message from Jason. It was simple. "I miss talking to you. I wish you were here." There was a warmth in those words, something she hadn't felt in ages. Her heart pounded in her chest as she hesitated, glancing around the empty house. David was gone. She had no one to answer to. She ran her thumb over the screen, typing back quickly, "I miss you too." The words were out before she could stop herself, and before she knew it she was typing more. The conversation grew more flirtatious, more personal. Jason, like before, seemed to have all the right things to say. She could feel the tension between them growing, a pressure building, an undeniable pull. Hours later, Rebecca found herself standing at her front door, waiting for the sound of Jason's knock. She couldn't believe what was happening, but at the same time she couldn't bring herself to stop it. He was here, in her house. He was going to be here in her arms, and for the first time in a long while, she wasn't alone. When Jason walked in, there were no words. Just a magnetic pull, a rush of emotions as their lips met in a kiss. Rebecca's body responded instantly, the heat between them undeniable. This wasn't the first time she'd kissed him, but it felt different this time. It felt real, and once that kiss deepened, once that wall of restraint was broken, there was no going back. The affair escalated quickly. What had started as emotional conversations and flirtations turned into physical encounters in David's own home. The place he thought was still his safe haven. The secrecy, the guilt, the passion. It all intertwined, and Rebecca couldn't stop herself from craving more. Jason, too, was caught up in it, his own internal guilt at war with his desires. He questioned what they were doing, but each time the temptation pulled him back in. He convinced himself that it was temporary, that it was just a way for both of them to cope with their own unmet needs. But as the affair grew more intense, so did the guilt. And neither of them could outrun it for long. David was almost giddy with excitement as he drove home. The last 2 weeks had felt like an eternity, and he couldn't wait to see Rebecca. He had been away long enough to start feeling like his old self again, healthier, stronger, ready to step back into the life he had left behind. The trip had gone well, and the time away had given him a sense of clarity. Now, with his body and mind on the mend, he was hopeful that he and Rebecca could finally start rebuilding what had slipped through their fingers. He glanced at his phone one last time before pulling into the driveway. A message from Rebecca flashed on the screen. "Looking forward to seeing you. Hope your trip was productive. I'm just here, waiting for you." There it was, the warmth he had longed for in her words, a glimmer of the closeness that he missed. He smiled to himself and locked his phone as he stepped out of the car. The house was eerily quiet, but he assumed she was simply waiting for him to come in, just as she always did when he returned from his trips. The front door creaked as he opened it, the familiar smell of home filling his senses, but there was something off. Something he couldn't quite place. The silence seemed heavier than usual, like the air itself was holding its breath. He took off his coat and placed his bag by the door, calling out for Rebecca. "Hey, I'm home." No response. David frowned, his mind racing. She had been excited for him to return, hadn't she? He shrugged it off and made his way toward their bedroom, thinking maybe she was in there, getting ready to greet him. As he walked down the hallway, he heard soft, muffled sounds coming from the bedroom. Whispers, faint moans, the rustling of sheets. His heart skipped a beat. For a moment he thought he might be imagining things. He stopped in his tracks, unsure of what he was hearing. He had only been gone for 2 weeks, and surely this couldn't be real. But the sounds continued, unmistakable now. His curiosity got the best of him, and against his better judgment he walked closer, drawn toward the noise. Every step seemed to echo louder in the empty house. He reached the bedroom door. He could feel his pulse quicken, his breath caught in his throat. Something didn't feel right. But nothing could have prepared him for what he was about to find. Edith pushed open the bedroom door with a shaking hand, his mind still trying to make sense of the situation. The moment the door creaked open, time seemed to stand still. There, in their bed, tangled in the sheets, were Rebecca and Jason, his wife, the woman he had loved for so long, and his best friend, the man he had trusted with his life. They were naked, their bodies entwined, completely oblivious to David's presence until the door had opened. David's heart slammed against his chest, and for a moment he couldn't breathe. His mind raced, trying to comprehend what he was seeing. His eyes moved from Rebecca to Jason and back to Rebecca, as if he were expecting them to disappear, like it couldn't be real, but it was. The moments stretched on forever, each second filled with crushing disbelief. Rebecca's eyes widened in shock when she saw him standing in the doorway. Jason's head snapped toward David, his face paling. It all happened too fast. The room was thick with tension, a suffocating silence hanging in the air as both of them froze, completely exposed. David stood there, shaking, his hands gripping the doorframe as if to steady himself. The world around him felt unreal, like he was outside his own body, watching everything happen from a distance. His mind screamed for answers, for some explanation, but none came. Rebecca tried to sit up, pulling the sheets around her body, but her face was already flushed with guilt. "David, I "I didn't mean for you to find out like this," she stammered, her voice trembling. Jason was silent, his eyes darting between Rebecca and David, shame written all over his face. He couldn't look David in the eye, the man who had been like a brother to him, the man whose trust he had shattered in the worst way imaginable. David couldn't even find his voice at first. The pain in his chest was too much to bear. He had spent the last 2 weeks imagining this moment in his head, but no thought, no preparation could have prepared him for this reality. He had trusted Jason with everything, his deepest secrets, his darkest moments, and now, this. David finally found his voice, but it came out hoarse, as though the words had been caught in his throat for too long. "What is this? How long has this been going on?" Rebecca's eyes filled with tears, and she wrapped her arms around herself, as if trying to shield herself from the truth. "David, please. I'm so sorry. I never meant for it to go this far. It started as something I didn't even realize was happening. It was emotional at first, but then, after everything, after your heart attack, I was so alone. I didn't know how to deal with it. And Jason, he was there for me." David's jaw clenched, the words cutting deeper than anything physical could. He looked at Jason, who had finally managed to sit up on the edge of the bed, his face ashen, his hands wringing the sheets. "You're supposed to be my best friend," David said through gritted teeth. "What the hell, Jason? You were like a brother to me. How could you do this?" Jason finally spoke, his voice low and guilty. "David, I never meant for it to happen. It wasn't planned. It just happened. I never wanted to hurt you. I couldn't stop it. I'm sorry, man. I'm really sorry." David shook his head, his mind reeling. "For months, Jason. While I've been out there, fighting to get back to normal, you were here with her, in my bed, in my life." His eyes filled with disbelief as he looked at Rebecca, who was now crying silently, her face buried in her hands. "And you let this happen. You let it go on." Rebecca looked up at him, her face streaked with tears. "I didn't know what else to do, David. I didn't know how to deal with everything that had changed between us. And Jason, he made me feel seen again. He made me feel like I mattered." The weight of her words hit him like a punch to the stomach. His knees felt weak, but he steadied himself against the doorframe, unwilling to break down in front of them. "I've given everything for you, Rebecca," David said, his voice breaking. "I fought to come back to you, to be the man you needed, and this is how you repay me?" The words stung, but they didn't hurt as much as the emptiness that filled him now. His life had shattered in an instant, and there was no putting it back together. The betrayal wasn't just physical, it was emotional. It was the man he had trusted, the man who had been there through thick and thin, and now Jason was the one who had helped break his world apart. David took a step back, his heart heavy with grief and rage. "I don't know who you are anymore," he whispered, before turning and walking out of the room, leaving Rebecca and Jason behind in the quiet aftermath of their betrayal. David slammed the door behind him, the sound reverberating through the empty house as he fled into the night. His chest was tight, each breath coming in short gasps. He could feel his heart pounding, but it wasn't from the physical exertion. It was the emotional weight that felt like a 1,000-pound anchor dragging him under. His mind raced, thoughts swirling in a chaotic storm, none of them making sense. The betrayal hit him like a physical blow. Each word, each glance, each stolen moment flashing through his mind like a slideshow of torment. His legs felt weak as he made his way to the car, hands trembling as he fumbled for the keys. The engine roared to life, but it did nothing to drown out the storm inside his mind. David pulled out of the driveway, the world around him becoming a blur. He didn't know where he was going, only that he needed to get away. The streets blurred into one long stretch of darkness. The rhythmic sound of the tires on the pavement was the only thing grounding him, but even that was starting to feel like too much. His mind kept replaying the scene. The look of shock on Rebecca's face, the guilt in Jason's eyes. David didn't know how long he had been driving, but the familiar sight of Greg's house appeared before him. His friend's place was a haven, somewhere he had always gone when life got too overwhelming. With shaky hands, he pulled into the driveway and stumbled out of the car. His thoughts were fragmented, chaotic, but he knew one thing. He needed to numb the pain. Greg, who had always been there for him, opened the door when David knocked. Seeing his friend in such distress, Greg immediately took one look at him and guided him inside without a word. The smell of Greg's home, a mix of old books and fresh coffee, was the last thing David remembered before the haze of alcohol began to overtake him. David reached for a glass of whiskey. He downed it in one go, the burn in his throat offering a brief distraction from the flood of emotions crashing over him. Another drink followed, and then another. The numbness spread quickly, like a warm blanket, comforting and suffocating all at once. David didn't care anymore. His world had shattered, and no amount of alcohol could fix it, but at least it made him forget for a little while. He drank and drank until his mind was a blur, his thoughts a tangled mess. His raw emotions began to seep out in slow waves. As the alcohol took hold, his control slipped away and the dam broke. David buried his face in his hands, the tears flowing freely now. The grief, the anger, the confusion, it all came pouring out. He had never allowed himself to break down like this before, never allowed himself to fully feel the depths of his pain. But here, with Greg, it was different. He didn't have to hold it together anymore. He didn't have to be strong. As the hours passed, David's mind grew darker. The alcohol clouded his thoughts, but in some ways it made everything clearer. His life felt like it had been destroyed in an instant. His wife, the woman he had loved, had betrayed him with his best friend. How could he ever face them again? How could he ever face the world? He stumbled to his feet, his vision spinning. Greg's house felt smaller now, suffocating him in its familiarity. He needed to escape. He needed to end it all, to make the pain stop. The thought had been building in his mind for hours, creeping in quietly but steadily, until now it was the only thing that made sense. Heading toward the bathroom, the door slammed shut behind him as he locked himself inside, the sound of it echoing in the stillness of the house. His body shook and his breath came in short gasps as he looked at the gleaming knife in the bathroom drawer. It was all he could focus on. The cool metallic edge, the promise of an end to the unbearable ache in his chest. David stood there for what felt like an eternity, staring at the knife. His mind was a swirl of anger, hurt, and hopelessness. He couldn't escape the pain. There was no way out. The voice in his head grew louder, urging him to end it now, to stop the torment before it consumed him completely. His hand trembled as he reached for the knife. His grip was tight, his fingers cold against the metal. He could feel his heart pounding in his ears, the darkness closing in around him. He raised the knife slowly, his gaze locked on the edge, his mind clouded with all the hurt, the betrayal, the overwhelming loss. Just as he was about to make the unthinkable decision, the door burst open. "David, no!" Greg's voice rang out with urgency. Greg was there in an instant, grabbing David's arm, his strength pulling the knife away just in time. David struggled, his mind a mess of rage and sorrow, but Greg held on firmly, his voice calm yet full of desperation. "Listen to me," Greg said, his voice breaking through the fog of despair. "This isn't the way out. You don't have to do this." David collapsed into Greg's arms, his body shaking with the intensity of everything he had been holding in. The knife fell to the floor with a dull thud, and David's sobs racked his body, louder than he had ever allowed himself to cry. It wasn't just the grief, it was the weight of all the emotions that had been bottled up inside him for so long, now spilling out with no way to stop them. Greg held him, whispering words of comfort though David couldn't hear them. His mind was numb. The pain still there, but it felt distant now, like something that belonged to another lifetime. David woke up the next morning with a pounding headache, the remnants of the alcohol still clinging to his body. His throat was dry, his mind foggy. He sat up slowly, trying to piece together the events of the night before. His eyes scanned the room, landing on the familiar walls of Greg's house. The reality of everything that had happened, the betrayal, his breakdown, the knife, felt like a bad dream, but it wasn't. It was his life now, and it was all real. As the fog of alcohol began to lift, there was something else in its place, a strange clarity. His chest felt tight, the weight of everything pressing down on him, but in that moment he realized something. He couldn't keep living like this. He couldn't keep wallowing in the darkness, consumed by the past. It had almost taken him from this world. But he didn't want to die. He wanted to rebuild. He looked over at Greg, who was already up and making coffee. Greg had been his anchor through it all, and David knew he had to make a change. He couldn't let this grief define him any longer. With Greg's quiet support, he began to take the first steps toward recovery. Therapy was one of those steps. He started seeing a counselor, someone who could help him process the anger, the betrayal, and the guilt that had taken root in his soul. David also joined a support group for men who had faced similar emotional pain. It was humbling, hearing other men share their stories of loss and healing. For the first time in weeks, he felt like he wasn't alone. There were others out there who understood the depths of his pain. He began to listen, to open up, and slowly, he started to heal. But the emotional wounds were deep, and it was clear that this journey wasn't going to be easy. As part of his journey, Greg invited David to attend a church group with him. Greg had always been a person of faith, and he saw something in David, a longing for peace. David had been skeptical at first, but something about the people in the group, the warmth of their kindness, began to pull at him. The weeks passed, and David began to rebuild his life step by step. He was starting to feel more like himself again, stronger, more grounded. But healing, as it always is, was a process. There were moments when the pain would resurface, moments when he questioned if he would ever truly move past the betrayal. He saw Rebecca's name pop up on his phone more times than he wanted to count, and each time his stomach twisted with the familiar sting. Her messages were apologetic, filled with regret, but David couldn't bring himself to respond. The hurt was too fresh, the betrayal too deep. Still, something inside him had shifted. He began to understand that forgiveness wasn't just for Rebecca. It was for him. He couldn't move forward if he kept holding on to the anger. He had to let go, not for her, but for himself. In the quiet moments, when he found himself alone with his thoughts, he began to forgive not because he had to, but because he realized that holding on to the pain only kept him trapped in the past. While David began his slow journey of healing, Rebecca's life was unraveling. The weight of the affair, the lies, and the hurt she had caused David crushed her from the inside. Her once confident and vibrant demeanor had dissolved into something unrecognizable. Each day felt like a blur, filled with regret, shame, and isolation. She had tried to reach out to David, sending message after message, leaving voicemails that went unanswered. She apologized, begged for forgiveness, but each attempt only seemed to drive him farther away. He had made it clear that he wanted no part of her anymore, emotionally, physically, or otherwise. He had cut ties with her completely, and with every message that went unanswered, Rebecca's sense of self began to fade. Her guilt consumed her. She replayed the moments in her mind over and over again. The lies, the betrayal, the look on David's face when he discovered what she had done. How could she have been so selfish? How could she have thrown away everything they had? She couldn't escape the suffocating weight of her decisions, and the more she tried to bury the guilt, the heavier it became. Rebecca turned to Jason, but he, too, had begun to distance himself. His guilt over the affair had become too much for him to bear. He couldn't face her, not after what they had done. Jason stopped answering her calls, ignored her texts, and eventually stopped showing up at all. Rebecca was left alone, abandoned by both the man she had betrayed and the man who had betrayed her trust. The isolation was deafening. At first, Rebecca tried to convince herself that she could find a way out of the darkness. But every attempt to regain control over her life felt hollow. Her friends, those few who hadn't turned away from her, tried to offer support, but it felt like they were speaking to someone who no longer existed. Every time they told her to move on, the words felt foreign, like a cruel joke. How could she move on when she had destroyed the only good thing she had ever known? The loneliness began to suffocate her, and she felt more and more detached from the world around her. Her apartment, once a place of comfort, felt like a prison. She no longer had the energy to go out, to smile, to pretend. Everything felt pointless. In a desperate attempt to numb the pain, Rebecca turned to substances. At first, it was just an occasional drink, something to take the edge off. But as the days grew heavier, she found herself reaching for more, her hands trembling as she poured another glass. The alcohol dulled the ache for a little while, but it never lasted. The moment the buzz faded, the guilt returned. Stronger, more suffocating than before. She started taking pills, mixing them with the alcohol, hoping the numbness would last just a little longer. But it never did. On one of those quiet, dark nights, as the clock ticked steadily in the background, Rebecca found herself sitting on the edge of her bed. She had no idea how many days had passed since she last spoke to anyone. Her body felt heavy, numb from the substances she had consumed. The silence in her apartment felt unbearable, but there was nothing left to say. No one to apologize to. In a quiet, heartbreaking decision, Rebecca took the pills. It wasn't done with rage, but with a quiet, exhausted surrender to everything that had led her here. She lay back on the bed, her eyes closing as the world around her faded to black. The news of Rebecca's passing spread quickly. Friends, family, and even David learned of the tragic end to her story. While David had moved on, focusing on his own healing and forgiveness, he couldn't help but feel a hollow pang of sadness when he heard, It wasn't for what they had, because that was gone, but for the woman she had become, a woman lost in the depths of her own mistakes. Rebecca's fate was a tragic reminder of the consequences of betrayal, not just for those who are betrayed, but for the one who causes the pain. In her last moments there was no redemption, no second chance, only the crushing weight of everything she had lost. The weeks that followed Rebecca's death were a quiet turning point for David. The pain of the past, though still a part of him, no longer had the power to consume him. His grief had been overwhelming, but now, with time, he had begun to rebuild. Slowly, painstakingly, David had built a new life, one that was centered around healing, faith, and the strength he had discovered within himself. David walked into a church one Sunday morning, the sunlight streaming through the stained glass windows and casting colorful shadows on the pews. The soft murmur of voices echoed around him as people greeted him with smiles and warmth. David had come a long way from the man he had once been, the man who had stumbled through a dark path of despair. Now he was no longer running from his pain. Instead, he was facing it, processing it, and using it as a foundation to rebuild himself. He had committed himself to his faith, to the belief that no matter how broken a person felt, there was always a way to start anew. There was always a chance for redemption, not just from others, but from within. With Greg's continued support and the bond of his growing community, David began to focus on the future instead of the past. Every day was a small victory, each step a testament to his resilience. As he walked toward the street, the sun hung low in the sky, casting a warm golden glow over everything in its path. The wind tousled his hair, and David took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the past slip further away with each step. He wasn't looking back anymore. There was no need. No matter the depth of the wound, no matter the heartbreak or betrayal, there is always a way forward. Redemption is not a destination, it's a journey. And no matter how dark the road may seem, there is always light ahead. For David, this was just the beginning of a new chapter. A chapter filled with hope, forgiveness, and the courage to walk into a future that was once unimaginable. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like and subscribe for more intense, unforgettable stories that will stay with you long after the screen fades.